Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much. I'm just going to check that we can go on to the next slide. I thought I better start with the location, just in case there's anybody who doesn't know where the Pillar of Elisig is. You can see it's quite close to Llangollen, and it's very close to Valley Crucis Cistercian Abbey, which we'll come back to in a minute. And you can see on the right here the view up the Nant Eglwysig Valley, because one of the important aspects of the Pillar of Elisig is that it stands very close to a junction of routes. What we're here doing is looking northwards up towards the pass through the mountains, Bwlch yr Oenant as it's called, and down into the Vale of Clwyd. So it's in a very important location on that north-south route from the Dee up to the North Welsh coast. But it's also very close to an east-west crossing just south of this point, which runs kind of along the north bank of the Dee. And this strategic location is absolutely crucial to the biography of the monument.
Nancy, chance of dimming the lights?
We can try if, yeah, we can take them out completely.
Do you want to?
Yeah, we can. Whoops, that's, how's that?
That's better.
That, okay. So what I'm going to be talking about today is relates to Project Elisig, which was run by myself and Gary Robinson and Howard Williams between 2010 and 2012, which was the actual excavation. And as you can see, it was funded by a very wide range of bodies, including the Society of Antiquaries. And the aim of the excavation, the aims of the excavation, the mound, as you can see in the left-hand side here, was in very bad condition at the time that the excavation took place. And we were allowed to investigate where there were kind of holes on the side of the mound, but also to re-excavate part of the antiquarian intrusion, which was made in 1773. And you can see that part going on the right-hand side of your screen. And I'll come back to the significance of this later on in the lecture. The writing up of this project, which has grown immensely, is coming to an end now, and we hope for publication with University of Wales Press in the not too distant future. So I thought I'd just start by asking, well, what is writing a cultural biography? Why are archaeologists kind of interested in this? Well, basically, theoretically, this goes back to Richard Bradley's iconic article, seminal article in 1987 called Time Regained, The Creation of Continuity, and also a volume of World Archaeology edited by him and Howard Williams in 1998 called The Past in the Past. And from this, I suppose, the concept that monuments could be reworked and reinvented in new ways over time to support new ideologies was coming into being. And this was kind of built on by Chris Goston and Yvonne Marshall in another volume of World Archaeology in 1999 on the cultural biography of monuments. And with this, we have the idea that a biographical approach of an artifact or a site can address the way social interactions involving people and monuments create meaning, and how, again, this meaning can be changed and manipulated over time. And this has been applied to other pieces of early medieval sculpture, notably the Bradbourne Cross in Derbyshire and the Hilton of Cudboll cross slab in northeast Scotland. But also we see the concept of what Cornelius Holtdorf and Howard Williams have called an accumulated landscape. In other words, you start with something simple and other things are attracted to that particular monument. And if you could just bear these concepts in mind as I carry on, I think that will help to explain the approach that I've used. Now, basically, what I'm going to do in this lecture is to examine these changes and reinventions of the Pillar of Elisig and the mound on which it stands over time. And I've only got time to look at some of the major reinventions. So I'm going to look at the prehistory and at the early Bronze Age cairn, burial cairn. Then I'm going to look at the reinvention of the monument in the 9th century by Cyngen or Concan, the Prince of Powys, who died in 854, and its probable function as an assembly and royal inauguration site at that time. Then I'm going to look at its reinvention of the monument as part of the monastic landscape of Valley Crucis Abbey. The cross gives its name to the Cistercian Abbey in the early 13th century. Then the destruction of the cross, probably during the Civil War, and as a result of that, antiquarian recording. Then its final major reinvention with the excavation and restoration of the Pillar of Elisig in the 1770s as part of the creation of the picturesque landscape of the Vale of Llangollen. I'll briefly allude, if I have time, to the row about prehistory, which stems from this monument in the 1840s, and to its coming into state care and guardianship. So let's go to the origins of the site immediately. And the excavation, you can see the major trenches that we dug, revealed a complex monument, which had two major phases. And what you can see on the left here is the platform cairn and curb, which was revealed in the trench nearest to us here. But in the other trench, we found, once we'd removed the antiquarian intrusion fill, we found two kists, both with cremated bone in them. One very small one, which you can see over there at the top, which had in fact been disturbed by the antiquarian intrusion, but there was enough to get radiocarbon dates from what remained. And then a major kist, which was set behind the curb on the top right there. And that is kist 3. And this was the largest burial kist with cremated bone that has ever been found in Wales. And it consisted of at least 6 individuals in 2 separate phases of burial. They were probably buried in bags and which were tied by bone pins. Now, in the second phase, the flat platform cairn with its curb is raised into a mound, again of stone. And you can see the 2 different phases here on the left. And another kist, which we excavated, was set into the upper part, the second phase of the monument. Now, unfortunately, this only had token cremated evidence in it, and it was not enough to get a radiocarbon date. No radiocarbon date was possible, but clearly it must be later than the earlier ones. And I just wanted to show you this because you can see that the lining of this large kist is made of mudstone. So it's decorated with these mudstone flows. And that was evidently intentional in the way that the person or people were buried in this kist. And these were the finds from the excavation, not very many, as you can see. You can see the bone pins, which probably fastened bags from the 2 deposits of cremated bone in Kist 2. We also had animal bones that had been cremated. And also the knife on the left there was in Kist 1. The little other small early Bronze Age flint came from somewhere else in the mound. Now, the radiocarbon dates, we were able to get radiocarbon dates from Kist 1 and radiocarbon dates from Kist 3. And these provided us with an early Bronze Age date, very common for this kind of monument, and around sort of 2000, 1900 BCE. So this is the Bronze Age beginning, if you like, of the site. And there was Howard Williams and Marietta Flores did a survey of the GIS survey of the landscape through time, which is published in Medieval Archaeology in 2017. And this raised the question as to what extent there was a ritual Bronze Age landscape in the prehistoric period. And one of the things that made us raise that question is, here's the Pillar of Elisig, and down here is an aerial view here. You can just about see what is probably an early Bronze Age ring ditch. And the ring ditch, we were not able, for reasons of agriculture, to investigate sites other than the Pillar of Elisig in the middle, on this site. So it's very tantalizing to have this likely ring ditch and not to have been able to investigate it. So we go on now to the second major phase in the reinvention of this monument in the 9th century AD. And essential to understanding this is the verses of Englynion y Beddau, the stanzas of the graves. Now, it's been shown in a recent book by Patrick Sims Williams that the stanzas of the graves are 12th century or earlier. It used to be thought that they were 9th or 10th, but now we can't be so sure. And that the stanzas of the graves are basically short verses about where early British heroes, mythical heroes, are buried. And this is thought to be in prehistoric monuments. And it's this idea of British heroes being buried in in prehistoric cairns and barrows, who are being celebrated for their warrior prowess. And essentially, it's because of that Cyngen chooses to use this site as the site of a cross. And in this early 9th century period, we can see a general interest in the writing down and reworking of early British history. And the classic text for that is Historia Britonum, the history of the Britons. And that was written in 829 or 830 in North Wales. And we can see many of the same concerns on the inscription on the Pillar of Elisig as we can see in the Historia Britonum. And so we can just see here that where the inscription on the cross shaft is, you can just about see it in the photograph, but I'm afraid we can't read it from that. Instead, we have to use antiquarian copies of the inscription. But before we do that, I just want to say a little bit about the form of the monument. Now, as it stands today, obviously it's lost its crosshead, and we'll come to that later on. But the actual circular form of the monument is modelled, well, is the similar things in England in the 9th century, such as the cross of Bechamet St. Bridget in Cumbria, which you can see again is fragmentary here. But in closer to home in Cheshire and Staffordshire, this type of cylindrical monument is relatively common in the late 10th and 11th centuries. And it's possible that there were wooden versions or versions that have not survived earlier than that. But there has also always been an idea that there was some kind of parallel with classical columns in Rome because of the round shape. And I've just put up there the column of Marcus Aurelius, because these were victory columns like Trajan's column, for example. And these, essentially, these crosses are also seen in this period as signs of victory. So we have two versions, well, we have two different antiquarians who recorded the inscription on the Pillar of Elisig. By far the most important is Edward Llwyd, who lived in the second half of the 18th century, sorry, the 17th century. And he visited the site in 1696. And he, as a result, made two, he transcribed what he could see of the inscription on the fallen monument. And one of these survives in the British Library, and I discovered the other one in Bangor University archives and special collections. Now, the importance of the inscription is that essentially it's a piece of royal propaganda. It's written in Latin, and the lettering is decorative and consciously antiquated at the time of the early 9th century. And this is to add weight to the inscription, because the document is couched in legal language, and they use the term in Latin cheirographum, which is similar to the words found in Celtic charters. For example, in the Llandaff charters, and it also tells us that the actual inscription was put together by a man called Conmark, who was presumably an ecclesiastic advising Cyngen. Now, essentially, the monument was erected by Cyngen in order to preserve the memory of his great-grandfather Elisig, or Elise. And it was erected, we know that Cyngen died in Rome in 854, and he was the last early medieval ruler of Powys. And his grandfather, Elise, was probably a contemporary of Offa of Mercia. And the inscription begins with a genealogy and then goes on to record the military success of Elise over the English in the late 8th century. Then it goes on to trace the origins of the kingdom of Powys back to the Roman usurper Magnus Maximus, who died in 388 in northern Italy, and also to trace them back to the sub-Roman ruler in Britain, Vortigern. So basically, it's all about the origins of the kingdom of Powys. These are, invented, but they're invented in order to legitimize the present rulers of Powys. The inscription also demonstrates links with the church, again, legitimizing the dynasty through the early Gaulish saint, St. Germanus, who is known as St. Garman in Welsh, and there's a hagiography of him in the Historia Brittonum. So what we're dealing here is with a legal document that is all about legitimating the ruling line of Powys at a time when they are increasingly under threat from Gwynedd on the one hand, but more seriously from Mercia on the other. And after the middle of the 9th century, the kingdom of Powys disappears because it's taken over parts by Gwynedd, parts by the English, and it doesn't re-emerge till the 12th century, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So now, is this site a site of assembly and royal inauguration? Well, the major reason why we think that it's a site of assembly and possibly royal inauguration is because of the content of the inscription. In the early 9th century, we have a number of, well, during the course of the 9th century, a number of royal monuments, most notably the Duplin Cross at Forteviot in Perthshire, which are articulating royal power through sculpture. And Forteviot is it's not actually on the site of the major royal complex, but there's a series of sites at Forteviot, and they again begin in the prehistoric period and are reinvented in the early medieval period. There are also a number of Anglo-Saxon sites like that as well. And you can even, at Clulow in Cheshire, it's been suggested that this is an assembly site on topographical grounds. Now, as far as the Pillar of Elisig is concerned, you can see here that it lies in this valley of the Nantagrisig, and in fact, it's on the end of a glacial spur. So if you were standing on top of the mound, you could proclaim to a whole lot of people underneath quite easily. And we know, for example, that the stone of Scone, the site of Scone, which also has an abbey in Scotland, which replaced Forteviot as the inauguration site of the rulers of Scotland, that this is a similar sort of topographical confection, I suppose. And Alexander III in 1249 was inaugurated on the stone of Scone, and the first thing that happened in the ceremony was that his genealogy was recited. And this reciting of genealogies seems to be important in making kings in Ireland and Scotland and in legitimizing kings. And therefore, the inscription on the Pillar of Elisig, which begins with a genealogy, seems to highlight this idea of legitimacy and the possibility of inaugurating a king on a prince on the site. So after the 9th century, this early medieval monument, we just don't know what happens for several centuries. But then it's reinvented as part of a monastic landscape. And you can see this monastic reinvention here on the left-hand side. Because to begin with, we had the accretion of the landscape with the early Bronze Age mound, with the early medieval cross placed on top of the cairn, the burial cairn, reinventing it. Well, now we get an accretion of the landscape from other monuments in that landscape. And this is brought into being with the founding of Vallecruchis Abbey, the Vale of the Cross, Glyn-y-Groes in Welsh, in 1201, a major Cistercian monastery, which was founded by Prince Madog ap Griffith Maelor. And he was the ruler of northern Powys. Now, it's important to state, and I can't go into the genealogical problems here, but the family are not related to the 9th century family, okay? But what they are doing is using this site to legitimize the new rulers of northern Powys with the resurrection of the kingdom of Powys, which is happening in the second half of the 12th century. And what happens is that the Cistercian abbey, it becomes, is patronized by Prince Madoc ap Griffith Maelor and his descendants until the time of the Edwardian conquest. And also they are buried there. And also the local gentry become buried there in the later part of the period. And the Pillar of Elisig, though it is now kind of off on the side, it's not within the immediate monastic complex, it lies outside the likely enclosure, still it would be seen as a major monument for all those who are passing by on the way to visiting visiting Valley Crucis Abbey, for example, or to receive alms or as pilgrims or whatever. And we know from late 15th century poetry in Welsh by Gytyn Owen, for example, that the monument was named a lot in his poetry and valued as an old monument, an old cross, and it is a cherished local landmark. And associated with this is not just Valley Crucis itself, but over here, the castle of Dinas Bran. So we have 3 monuments now, all in the same sort of area. And Dinas Bran was built by the son, Griffith, of Madoc ap Griffith Maelor. It's not occupied for very long, but it's a very atmospheric site. It's not very defendable in as much as it overlooks the Dee. It's there to make a major mark in the landscape. It's a bit like Tintagel, for example, with the new medieval castle, in that case, on top of a major early medieval site. In this case, it's within an Iron Age hill fort, but the chronology of Castell Dinas Bran is not very well understood, and Heneb are currently conducting excavations to try and ascertain more clearly the chronology of the site. So when we come to the Reformation, of course, everything changes very fast indeed. And the attitudes to the Pillar of Elisig change not exactly overnight, but it's now regarded not as a cherished Christian monument where you might stop and pray on the way north-south on that route, for example, but it's now seen as an object of superstition, and therefore it's in danger of iconoclastic destruction. Now, we know that Valley Crucis Abbey was suppressed in the dissolution quite early on, probably around January 1537 or just before that, and the estate is granted to Sir William Pickering. Now, Sir William Pickering was in Yorkshire, and there are a series of, I presume, absentee landlords in this period. And William Pickering I died in 1542. And his job really was to see that people on his behalf and for the crown stripped the lead off the buildings and began to actually pull the buildings down, but they didn't get very far. And at the same time, locals were also taking advantage of an empty site and also pinching stone for local building. Now, I don't think it's in this period that the cross is destroyed. And the reason I think it's later on during the Civil War is because Edward Llwyd, following a comment by John Aubrey in the 1680s, and John Aubrey was an antiquarian with very good Welsh connections. He thought, as a result of correspondence with another antiquarian, Meredith Lloyd, I think his name was, that it might have occurred during the Civil War. There was a general feeling in the 1680s that it had occurred then. And we know that in the 1640s, there was an order of Parliament during the First Civil War, and I quote, to remove all images and pictures from all open places whatsoever. Before that, the iconoclasm had tended to be within cathedrals and churches, and the stripping of the altars of plate and so forth, and images, and indeed relics. But I think that in this instance, we know there was a parliamentary army in the area of Ruthin and Chirk in 1644. And this would seem to be the most likely context in which the Pillar of Elisig was essentially the crosshead, which is very common in these instances, was destroyed altogether. It's never been refound. And the whole of the thing was toppled over. And at that stage, the inscription, because it was on its side, really started to deteriorate. The cross is sandstone. And as early as 1648, Robert Vaughan of Hengort, who was a famous collector of manuscripts after when they were dispersed from monasteries after the Reformation, he visited the site and he made a copy of part of the inscription in his commonplace book in 1648. At this time, he was trying to write a history of the British, and he was clearly extremely interested in the monument because of the genealogy. He was a genealogist as well. And this was what drove him, presumably, to visit the site and write down what he could. But for us, as I explained earlier, the really important records are by Edward Llwyd. And he visited the site in 1696 and recorded the fallen pillar. And I showed you the Bangor University manuscript last time. This is the British Library version, Harley MS 3780, folio 95. And I think you can see his careful transcript, but you can also see very clearly that a number of the beginnings of the lines lower down the inscription are missing, which is why the reconstruction has proved for scholars really quite difficult to do. Now, these antiquarian records are the basis that we still use today, and they're also because they were recording all these things because they were extremely worried about what was being lost altogether at the time. So we don't get much scholarly work on the Pillar of Elisig then until the early 20th century. There's an enormous gap. Instead, what we get is the reinvention of the monument in the 1770s in a completely different way, which I find absolutely fascinating. Now, the 1770s, apart from the colonial things like the loss of America and the rapid growth of the British Empire elsewhere, was also interesting because of a resurgence of ideas about British and indeed, well, Welsh history, Scottish history, the time of Ossian, for example, in Scotland, and also ideas about picturesque landscapes and or sublime landscapes, and also concepts of the Gothic. Now, I haven't got time to talk about this in enormous detail, but I thought that what would give you a flavour of the period best is Thomas Jones' wonderful picture of the Bard, which was painted in 1774, and you can go and see that in Amgueddfa Cymru. And this extraordinary picture was inspired by Thomas Gray's poem, which he wrote in 1757, called The Bard. And this is basically a mythical story of how only one bard was left in Wales because all the others had been killed by the army of Edward I. And you can see the kind of blighted trees, the very dramatic hilly landscape, rocky landscape, indeed a sort of Stonehenge in one point of the painting. And the last bard, I think with his lyre there, sort of staving off the end. Now, at the same time, just before, well, in the next decade after this poem was written and the period just before the painting, there was also the first Gothic novel produced, which I would heartily recommend for an extraordinary read, The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. And this just shows you the opening page of that. And this story, like many Gothic novels, for example, by Anna Radcliffe and indeed Walter Scott, and shows a complete reinvention of late abbeys in particular and castles to suit this Gothic taste of them being used for torture and all sorts of things. And also they recreate, I mean, the Castle of Otranto has a monument that is a sort of tomb that looks rather like the Pillar of Elisig. Now, oops, sorry.
No, you picked up the.
Here we are. Now, at the same time as this resurgence of British and Gothic and picturesque, we also have a large number of aristocrats going to Rome on the Grand Tour, and this is going on in the course of the 17th century. And the most famous from Northeast Wales was the young, very wealthy aristocrat, Sir Watkin Williams-Wynne. And you can see that his dates overlap with the recreation of the Pillar of Elisig. And he went to Rome in 1768, and he was painted by the major portrait painter, Italian portrait painter of the day, Pompeo Bertoni. And again, you can see that in Amgueddfa Cymru. And what they did was, these aristocrats, was they went to Rome and Naples and various other places, but they did things like measuring obelisks and so forth, which very much makes, and we'll see in a minute, that the Pillar of Elisig is now treated as an obelisk and not as a cross. Now, there were artists also from Wales who were going to Italy at this time. The most important of these was Richard Wilson, and he began in Italy in the 1760s. He was painting classical landscapes with sort of local and heroic figures, like this one of Lake Venus. They were influenced by Claude, for example. And but when he comes back from Wales, he is patronised by Sir Watkin Williams-Wynne, and so he paints Dinas Bran, which you can see here. And this wonderful painting is now in in Princeton, I think, in Yale. And you can see the ruins there in this kind of romantic landscape that's bathed in sort of Italian light. And he painted 2 pictures for Sir Watkin Williams-Wynne. But from our point of view, the really interesting picture is a picture right at the end of his life, because he painted this ancient British landscape. It's quite a small picture in the National Library. And you can see here, again, Dinas Bran, a rather blighted tree here, but it's an ancient British landscape. And what has it got in it? In the wrong place, I might add, but the Pillar of Elisig. And he died 2 years later after painting this picture, because by that time he was living very close to to Llangollen. So what was culture like in Llangollen in the 1770s? Well, we can see this through the work of the artist William Parry and his family, because they too had the patronage of Sir Watkin Williams-Wynne. And we can see an early portrait by William Parry of a young Sir Watkin Williams-Wynne in 1770 here with his dog. And then we can also see that William Parry's father, William Parry was a famous harpist. John Parry was his father, was a famous harpist who was blind, and he was played in London and in the area around Llangollen for the Watkin Williams family, and the other character is probably William Parry's brother. But William Parry also painted the man who excavated the antiquarian intrusion in the Pillar of Elisig. And that was Trevor Lloyd, and you can see him over there on the right with his staff, but also Dinas Bran behind him. So what was Trevor Lloyd's excavation consist of? Well, basically, he dug downwards and then outwards. And before the Pillar of Elisig was reinstated. And you can see the area of the antiquarian intrusion is marked here in dark grey. That's just, we've done that so you can see it. And in the area of the antiquarian intrusion, a number of pieces of 17th or 18th century pottery were found, also clay pipe fragments, which were clearly the workmen who were actually conducting this antiquarian, dig, if you like. And we know that they found at least one kist, the kist that we re-excavated, which was on the right-hand side of that antiquarian intrusion. Now, he did the excavation in 1773, and in 1779 he re-erected the pillar in the base, which had been on top of the mound throughout. But as you can see, he mounted the base on a plinth. And he put a Latin inscription on the back of the cross. And in that, he tells us, that which remains of this old monument, long removed from eyes and neglected, T. Lloyd of Trevor Hall, finally restored in AD 1779. So why, I suppose the question one asks is what was he doing in the excavation? Well, I think what he was doing was that he was trying to find the burial of Elise, essentially, because from this time onwards, it's equated with an early medieval burial site, not anything prehistoric. And we need to bear that in mind in what happens later on. Now, what Trevor Lloyd was doing was he was creating and I suppose recreating elements in a picturesque landscape. And what we have here is Valley Crucis, and you can see a summer house here. He erected that summer house, it's got his initials on it, in 1773. And the idea was that you could view the monument from Valley Crucis Abbey. You can see it from that little summer house over the caravan site now, just there. That's the view from the summer house. So the main object of visitors was Valley Crucis, followed by Dinas Bran. But they were also encouraged by their excavation to also visit the Pillar of Elisig as the grave of the early medieval ruler of Powys. Now, how was these ideas promulgated, so to speak? Well, it was the time from the 1770s onwards, and particularly during the Napoleonic Wars in the 1790s and early 19th century, we have visitors were not able to travel overseas. So instead, they visited the lakes, or they visited for the picturesque landscape, or they visited the Vale of Llangollen. And essential to promulgating tourism in the Llangollen area was the works of Thomas Pennant. Now, Thomas Pennant clearly knew Trevor Lloyd, I think, and he produced a tour of North Wales it was published between 1778 and 1783. And he's the only person that actually tells us that the excavation took place. Within these last few years, the tumulus was opened and the relics of certain bones found there, placed as usual between some flat stones. So he actually tells us that they dug up kists. And the guidebook essentially tells you how to go round these monuments. It provides you with a route. And it's accompanied by one of his two artists, the more famous Moses Griffith. And you can see Moses Griffith's drawing of the Pillar of Elisig here before it was re-erected, but when it has the inscription on it. And that was an engraving in the book. Now, by this period, it's doubtful whether the Pillar of Elisig was seen as a cross at all, because there were still feelings, I think, religious feelings against such monuments. But instead, it was seen as an obelisk. And we know this because a sketch by the antiquary James Barrington, dated to 1773, shows the cross before, when at the time of the excavation down. The actual sketch was probably by Moses Griffith, but it was sent by James Barrington and displayed in a meeting of the Society of Antiquaries in London on the 20th of May, 1773. And you can go and see it in the minute book of the Society of Antiquaries. And this shows the actual cylinder of the cross shaft on the floor, shows this on the base on top of the mound, but then it shows a reconstruction as an obelisk. And at this time, a number of monuments, former crosses, were being reinvented as classical obelisks. And this is one, later medieval market cross from in Ruthin, which was re-erected in that way in 1760. So it was natural to think of them as columns, not as crosses. So it's the sort of ultimate reinvention, if you like, as something else. Now, during the period of the Napoleonic Wars in particular, there were large numbers of travellers and artists came to the Vale of Llangollen. And a number of extremely interesting sketches and paintings were carried out. I just want to show you two. And the first is by Turner, and you can see this very pale notebook sketch. He probably visited it in 1794 when he was only about 19, wasn't he? And he's just before Richard Coltor, the famous antiquary, acts as his patron. So at this time, he's clearly interested in British history and British history painting. And he goes on to do a watercolor of Valicrucis Abbey. And he also, his painting later on for when he becomes a Royal Academician, is of Dolbaden Castle. And that is a British history painting. On the other hand, we've got Thomas Rowlandson in 1797, and he shows a guide showing tourists the monument. And you can see also Valicrucis down on one side. Now, by the 1820s, there's a new guidebook, Simpson's guidebook, and by this time, it's made into a kind of mythical status, you know? And it goes on about a coin, a silver coin being found in the coffin of presumably the grave of Elisig, and that the skull was gilded to preserve it, and then seen deposited with its kindred bones. Now, this is classic kind of Gothic romanticism, and it's made up. So the monument is being reinvented in this kind of mythical way. Now, I suppose finally, the row about prehistory. Now, because the Pillar of Elisig was now perceived to be the burial place of Elise, the Prince of Powys, in the late 8th century. By the time we get the foundation of the Cambrians in 1846 to 7, one of the two major founders was the Reverend John Williams, known as Ab Ithel. And as you can see, he was a cleric, but he was also very much a romanticist who believed in things like Ossian and believed in Iolo Morgannwg. So in Archaeologia Cambrensis in 1851, he writes, "We have in the monument in question a remarkable proof of the late period to which the custom of burying in tumuli was carried down by the Britons." So what he's arguing is that prehistory is extremely short, going back to the biblical model, and that what we're seeing is prehistoric customs of the ancient Britons being continued up to the time of Elise, because they're still being buried in prehistoric type cairns. And the idea of a deep time in prehistory was very slow to catch on in Wales. And the major reason, I think, why it was because of the notions that Ab Ithel put about the Pillar of Elisig. So in the second half of the 19th century, the pillar becomes essentially a forgotten monument. And this rather interesting 1905 image of the Abbey Fields with the Pillar of Elisig, which has by then trees growing, which is why we were still getting rid of bits of tree in 2010. You can see it was used as a Boer War training camp site. I mean, there was a Boer War militia after the Boer War, and they used this site as a training camp. And we did, in fact, find artifacts like penknives and things which were almost certainly to do with this camping. Now, it was only with Sir John Rees's article in 1908 in a Cymrodor, the name of the article is All Around the Wrekin, that we get the reassessment of the early medieval significance of the Pillar of Elisig. He looks at the inscription in depth, and he's drawing on Edward Llwyd, and the work that I did in the early 2000s is essentially stemming from that article. And so what Sir John Rees did, and also the foundation of the Royal Commission on the Ancient Historic Monuments of Wales in the early 20th century, they're bringing this monument back as in an academic fashion. And they're also calling on it to be protected, because by that time, I mean, there's a lot of letters which Sian Rees has looked at indicating its poor condition. And of course, in a sense, the monument was scheduled early on the 29th of December 1923, and the deed of guardianship was in 1937, which is again early. And in some senses, obviously, guardianship and scheduling protects the monument. And you can see how the monument looks today, rather pristine after returfing, after the excavation. And you can see its current interpretation, the Rayleigh-Radford version on the left and the modern Cadw version on the right. And in some senses, I suppose, it sets a monument in aspic. We're not going to get, in the foreseeable future, the reinvention of the monument in such radical ways as I've tried to show today. Because the monument, as I hope I've shown, has both a fascinating and a very complex biography. And there's a need, I think, to think very hard about the ways that we explain monuments of this kind when they have such a complex history. So what I've tried to do is to show you the prehistoric origins, the early medieval reinvention, the kind of accretion and reinvention in the later medieval period, its destruction, its radical reinvention in the late 18th century, and then it's the final brought into kind of an archaeological professionalism in the early 20th century. Diolch fawr iawn.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Oh, yes.
There's a microphone,
yeah.
if you don't mind.
Thank you so much for that fantastic display of a monument through time. I think it's just so fascinating looking at any monument through its different phases and different ages of interpretation, how we look at a monument. And I think it's only by doing work of that sort, jolly painstaking and long term it takes, that we can really understand the monuments that we've inherited today. And we have to look after, and it's so important when you explain the whole transformation of this monument, this landscape, and even before the Bronze Age. I mean, what did it look like before the Bronze Age? So it's just so important that we understand them fully, and so that we can look after them. But I bet you anything that we haven't put it into aspic. And looking at the work that Cadw's been doing just recently on monuments, I think that things do change quite a lot now. But yes, we are in a different phase now. We're in a phase of sort of public archaeology, public accessible monuments. And it's just fascinating to see how attitudes have changed. I think we surely will have some questions, and we got some Zoom people as well. And Chris is going to look after them. But in the first instance, could we have questions from the floor? Yeah.
The depiction of Vortigern in the Historia is not very flattering.
No.
Do you think that's significant?
It's not flattering in Bede either, is it?
No.
I think that's the crucial thing to go back to. The the thing is that the in the Historia Brittonum, the Vortigern is linked with the area of Powys, sort of further down, and it's also thought to have died down there, if I remember rightly. And I think that there are probably more than one story or myth or combination of the two about Vortigern that's going on at this time, because essentially what they're doing with the Pillar of Elisig, if I have interpreted it correctly, is that they're using first Magnus Maximus as the progenitor, if you like, of this line, though in fact the line is probably only comes in the 8th century. So they're inventing it. And then they are grafting on to this person who died in Aquileia, a long-standing British element. And they actually have Vortigern, his wife on the inscription is Severa, who is Magnus Maximus's daughter. I think I've got it right. And then there's a son called Britu, which who Bengai thinks might be an eponym, I think, for Powys itself. So that is essentially, it's all manipulation, and I think that's why it gets a better press in this instance than what Bede, for example, or the Historia Brittonum was saying.
When I was the inspector for the area, I did notice always the great drop-off between the field next door and the mound itself. And I'd often wondered whether, in fact, when the landscape was being sort of manipulated for picturesque reasons, and the view from the oriel window in the summer house, whether or not actually the ground level was lowered or the mound actually enhanced.
We think that
make it look better.
that where the field, it was put on top of a little plinth, so you can see it. You couldn't see it before, and the plinth that what's odd is that in some of the painting, pictures like Turner's little sketch, and indeed the other one I showed you, the plinth doesn't look very tidy, but I think they're making it look kind of romantic, because they move the monuments round, they often show Dinas Bran, which you can't see from the Pillar of Elisig. But we came to the conclusion when we did the LiDAR survey, and I didn't discuss this, I didn't have time, that where that field boundary is, that it has been manipulated, and it's all to give the impression when you're moving up towards it that it's higher than it is. And you have to remember that it's on the end of this glacial ridge. It's quite pronounced, the glacier, terribly, really, really acidic soil. But when you're there, you get this idea. We did sort of play around with how far sound, you could project your voice from there, and it was quite a way. And that's why one of the reasons for thinking it might be an assembly site, because of that position. But of course, if it's changed in order to make it this Gothic monument or British, early sort of British heroes monument in the 18th century, they are going to change it, aren't they? I mean, I have yet to contact, one of the things I need to do is to contact the Lloyd family, because they own the portrait that I showed you, to see what I've been through various archives, but there's not an enormous amount about him in public archives that I can find. So they might have things as well that might be helpful.
The other, just occasionally, musing in a sort of mental, iconoclastic sort of way, is whether or not the cross was always on the top of that mound. We got it down the bottom, and we got bits of stone and so on. But if it was an assembly site, there any mileage in thinking that actually, and there were probably other mounds, other prehistoric mounds around there, could we possibly having the person who's doing the declaiming on the top of the mound and
Well, it's
the
not
cross somewhere else?
impossible. All we know from the Moses Griffith drawing that went to the Society of Antiquaries was it was on top of the mound when
Then, yeah.
then there was a rakish angle. I think it likely it was on top of the mound. There is enough room for people to stand on top of the mound and for the genealogy to be read out and, you know, or whatever, to an assembled audience beneath. And I mean, because of the acidic soil, we're very unlikely to find much in the way of artifacts. And I mean, I've toyed with the idea, well, you know, massed tents or something, which is perfectly possible, but it wouldn't leave anything behind because of, you know, I think the soil is something like 3 or 4. We did a pH and it was very, very acidic.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions. First of all, about the bone needle that you found.
Yeah,
It had a notch in it rather than an eye. Do you think the eye?
I think it's broken. I think
broken.
it's broken. Yeah, one of the bone pins, if you like, was broken in 2,
Yeah.
and the other one was more, but it wasn't completely whole.
Okay.
And I think we were lucky we got anything, to be honest with you, other than stone, because of the soil.
The second question is, it's not easy to break up the crosshead
No,
without leaving fragments around. I wonder whether it had been used as target practice during the Civil War.
well, I wouldn't know whether they'd be used as target practice, but I think it likely that they're either in the wall, bits are in the walls round about, and there's major hedges and, you know, all the rest of it. Or they were carted off somewhere for building material. And I mean, a large number of crosses, Anglo-Saxon crosses, and you know, crosses in Britain and Ireland, particularly Northern Ireland rather than the South, survive as essentially the shafts and the bases, and they're reinterpreted as obelisks because, I mean, from the point of iconoclasm, you get rid of the top, but these monuments are often treasured, and therefore you get rid of as little as possible. I mean, we know that the White Cross in Tarvin, in Cheshire, was actually brought down by Civil War soldiers, you know, on Cromwell's side, and they did find in an excavation, archaeological excavation, they did find part of the cross head, but that is exceptional because the actual documentation, you know, in the Civil War actually describes them at Tarvin. And I've tried to do this for the Pillar of Elisig, which is why I know they were in Ruthin and in Chirk in 1644, but obviously I haven't got them. And we looked at the post-medieval pottery that is in the antiquarian, I'm just trying to think of the first name of Julie Edwards, who looked at the pottery for us. She couldn't be absolutely sure what was 17th century and what was 18th century, but she did think it was possible that some of it might have got into the mound in the antiquarian, you know, excavation, but had been in fact dumped in the 1640s, but she couldn't, you know, it's just too precise.
Is there a question over there? Yeah.
Yes, if there's time. I actually wanted to come back to the Reverend John Williams at Ithel because he would have been anything but alone in the middle of the 19th century,
absolutely.
even amongst thinking and articulate and sensible people in wanting to put history within a biblical framework.
Absolutely not, yeah.
Prehistory too. And it sounded a little bit as if you were suggesting there was a sort of cause and effect relationship between what he said in 1851 and then this actually really quite strange neglect of the monument for the next 75 years, which I'm just sort of asking you, is that really what?
Well, I suppose I simplified it. on the one hand, I mean, it's not really until, if I remember correctly, it's the 1870s or so that that the Cambrians begin absolutely, accept a longer prehistory. I do think that in the kind of that the romantic view of the Vale of Llangollen had essentially changed. And one of the reasons for this is industrialization, things like the building of the Pontcysyllte Aqueduct in the 1820s, is it?
Bit before that.
Bit before that, right. And the arrival of the railways. I mean, George Borrow is the last of the sort of, he's a romantic and he hates going on the railway. And he arrives by railway in Northeast Wales and then walks around North Wales. But he is thought to be very outdated by the time he was doing what he was doing, this romantic outview. And I think essentially what changes is the romantic outlook. But in the case of Aberfell, it's very interesting. He dug at Valley Crucis actually, is that it's, I suppose, the last time that this very, very conservative view of using the early medieval period to shorten prehistory is that I could, in Wales, it's used. I mean, it's used in plenty of other ways. So it's a contributory factor.
Any Zoom questions? No Zoom questions. Anything more anybody would like to contribute? It doesn't have to be a question. We can take comment, can we not? Anybody else? Any views? Yes, yeah.
It's not a view, it's just a question.
Oh, a question, yes.
Well, when we had a very early photograph, there was some they redug, had been dug before, top of the mound. There were some foundations. What looked like foundations.
Yeah. I don't think they were foundations. In the 1920s, I think there's a certain amount of repairing going on. And it looks a bit tidier these days than it did, because they put up the railings and that sort of thing. It must have been the photograph in Sir John Rees's article, I think, because that's the earliest photograph I showed.
It was early in your lecture, yeah.
Your re-excavation.
Oh, right, okay. See if we can find it. Whoop.
Quite early on.
Oh, we're not going to be able to do it, I'm afraid. It's just too difficult. But I mean, obviously, the pillar, has been kind of periodically looked at by Cadw, to maintain it, hasn't it? And I mean, there's some interesting graffiti actually on the cross space, with little bits that have been stuck back on, and they put their initials on the bits. But sorry, I can't really help with that. But my suspicion is that there's been quite a lot of repairs over time, because it's dry stone essentially, and
Well, if that's brought everybody's comments. Oh, Elizabeth, were you waving? No, you weren't. Sorry. I'd just like to reiterate our great thanks to you indeed for not only giving us the lecture, but the extraordinary amount of work that's gone into it. As I said, if we could all have the amount of time to look into every one of our Cadw monuments, wouldn't that be absolutely fantastic? We'd understand them so much better. And it's just terrific to see that this work has been done on this particularly interesting and atmospheric monument. So thank you very much indeed.